Let's take a look at Bombina species, the fire-bellied toads. They're a genus of toads found in Europe and Asia. They're generally about 6 centimeters in size, with Bombina maxima being somewhat larger. Here we have Bombina variegata, the yellow-bellied toad. And this is a baby one. It's a bit mottled at the moment, but it will soon fully colour up. And now an adult Bombina variegata. Bombina orientalis now, a young one about a year old. And here's an adult, and look at the colour of the toes. It's an indication of what the belly's like. Look at the stomach. That's why they're called fire-bellied toads. So why do our Bombina have such brightly coloured bellies? Well, it's a defence mechanism. If they're alarmed, they will curl up, exposing the bright colours on their bellies as a warning that they are poisonous. More Bombina orientalis. The ones on the right hand side are as you would expect to see them, but the one on the left hand side, which is a later image of one of the ones on the right hand side, has been kept on a dark substrate and darkened up. Breeders are developing colour variants of Bombina orientalis, mainly blue, like the example shown here. However, albino versions are often seen. So now we have Bombina bombina, the European fire-bellied toad. It's got a more orange belly than variegata, but not as bright as Bombina orientalis. Bombina bombina's back is slightly lighter in colour than Bombina variegata, and is also flecked, rather like Bombina orientalis. Now let's take a look at Bombina maxima. It's easy to recognise as it's much larger than the other species and has a very warty, lumpy skin. And Bombina, like most amphibians, are really great escape artists. Breeding toads. Identifying the gender of your toads. During the breeding season, all male toads develop nuptial pads, which enable them to clasp around the waist of the female while fertilising her eggs. And here we see the nuptial pads on a male Bombina maxima. And here we have a pair of Bombina maxima in what's called amplexus. The male has the female by the back legs and is ready to fertilise any eggs that she lays. And males would generally have sharper nodes on their back. And here we have Bombina variegata spawn. Now, younger females tend to lay smaller clumps and fewer eggs than more mature females, and this applies to all Bombina species. Location. So where do our Bombina come from? Well, let's start with Bombina variegata, the yellow-bellied toad. It's native to southern Europe, north of the Alps, and the countries along the east side of the Adriatic Sea. Now, there are a couple of Bombina variegata subspecies which are native to subalpine Italy and the area known as the Southern Balkans, but we'll come back to those in a short while. Now Bombina bombina. It's native to Central Europe and its range spreads quite a way towards the east. In those areas where Bombina variegata and Bombina bombina overlap, there is quite a bit of hybridization. And Bombina maxima is native to southern China and is limited to an area within the provinces of Sichuan, Yunnan and Guizhou. There is a species similar to Bombina maxima, Bombina microdella digitoria, with isolated populations in these 3 Chinese provinces. This differs from Bombina maxima in that it has less webbing between the toes and generally has a mottled green appearance. Bombina orientalis is usually found at several hundred meters above sea level in southeastern Siberia, northeastern China and Korea. And there is some discussion as to whether those toads from Korea are actually a separate species. Now let's return to the 2 subspecies of Bombina variegata, both of which are not commonly available. Let's look at Bombina pachypus, the Apennine yellow-bellied toad, and its range covers areas of rural Italy, but it never made it to Sicily. and there is some discussion as to whether it's actually a separate species rather than a subspecies of Bombina variegata. And Bombina scabra, native to southern Europe to the west of the Caucasus, generally the area best known as the southern Balkans. Its range overlaps with Bombina variegata. Feeding. Well, what will they eat? Just about anything that will fit in their mouths. That includes things like flies, woodlice, fishing maggots, some worms, and locusts. But locusts are generally a bit crunchy for them. And of course, crickets and mealworms are generally available online. There are some 22 different species of earthworm listed as resident in the UK. However, we only really need concern ourselves with two, the lobworm and the dendrobina worm, with perhaps the addition of whiteworms if you're breeding amphibians. Dendrobina worms reach about 4 centimetres and can be eaten by some of the larger adults. If you're breeding amphibians, you'll need to feed the youngsters, and whiteworms are an ideal source of food for baby amphibians that have just become terrestrial, like these. Whiteworm cultures are generally available online, and there are lots of videos on YouTube on how to breed them. Frogs and toads, like all amphibians, are cannibalistic, so it's really not a good idea to keep differing sizes in the same enclosure. And now to crickets. Both types of cricket are shown here. The brown is silent, the black ones are really quite noisy when they start chirping. Now, crickets are available in all sorts of sizes, from just hatched up to about an inch in size. The size you buy will depend upon what you're feeding them to. If you're breeding toads, or indeed any amphibian, you're going to need the really small ones. But they do get up, as I said, to about an inch in size. And be careful when ordering mealworms online, as the majority of them are supplied dead as bird feed. And when feeding your Bombina, you need to ensure that any insects that drop into the water are removed before they go rotten. Temperature. Now, as to temperature, some people advocate keeping them indoors at about room temperature, and this is perfectly viable. However, if we go back to the distribution map, you'll see that some of them come from areas which are subject to really harsh winters and will tolerate sub-zero temperatures for a while if kept in a closed environment. And personally, I overwinter mine in an unheated shed in enclosures like this, but any vented, usually plastic container will do. And of course, you can't just forget about them while they're in brumation, which is the term applied to reptiles and amphibians instead of hibernation. Housing your toads. Now to housing them. Firstly, the standard aquarium. It's available in lots of sizes and from lots of places. You may, however, want something that's purpose-built for reptiles and amphibians. There are several varieties, makes available, most of which have front doors that open, allowing easy access. These are generally available online or from specialist reptile shops. And as I've said elsewhere, Firebellied toads are great escape artists, so you'll need to ensure you have a tight-fitting lid on an aquarium. But this is not the case with proper reptile enclosures, as they usually have a mesh lid. As to how many toads to keep in an enclosure, I'd suggest that each one requires an area around about 25 centimetres by 25 centimetres. And although you should change at least half the water in the tank once a fortnight, you still need to provide enough environment to process any waste products the toads produce. During the summer months, I keep and breed my amphibians, both the Bombina and my collection of newts, outdoors in these converted shipping crates. Now, the net over the top is not to stop them escaping, but to stop things getting in and either taking them or taking their food. And this is what I mean. You thieving little bugger, you. Still, you can't complain.